Thank you very much for the invite to speak to you all on the constitutional amendment process, where we are, and also about things that I think are important in land reform. I am sorry that I cannot be there live, but I hope that this will give us some things to talk about in the future. Because 2020 has been such a tumultuous year, and it's at times almost impossible to imagine what the world looked like pre-COVID, where we were having debates in Parliament, in hallways, in halls, about the amendment of the Constitution and the future of land reform in South Africa. But now it seems like Parliament is getting used to conducting sessions online, and we are all getting used to zooming in and out and jumping in and out of Teams from the safety of our homes. So hopefully things will slowly get back on track again. And I hope to give you things to look out for, to participate in. Of course, COVID had a profound impact in many ways. We will get to that later, hopefully. But for now, just a short recap of what is happening with the constitutional amendment and what is new in land reform. I'm going to do a short recap to remind you all where we are in the process of amending Section 25 of the Constitution. And I'm going to do a historical look over because I think it's quite important to remember the whole process. So we will have to think back to February 2018, and we will remember the motion there that the EFF tabled, that the ANC amended, and that was accepted. And that led to the Joint Constitutional Review Committee with the chair, Vincent Smith, being tasked by Parliament to go out and ask South Africans if the Constitution should be amended. So a binary question, only the question, should it be amended, yes or no? And that was the first round of public input. You will all remember the emotive scenes at many of the hearings and the frustrations that came out there. And then eventually this committee tabled its report in November 2018, and it found that yes, it must be amended, but quite specifically it must be amended to make explicit what is implicit in Section 25. So if I was a little bit cheeky, I would probably add here that the problem is that there is no real agreement on what is implicit, which is why I think we are here. But I'm not cheeky. So I will just continue to explain that also during this time we had an expropriation bill that was published by the Department of Public Works for comment, and the National Assembly then re-established, in terms of Rule 253 for those who want to look it up, an ad hoc committee to amend Section 25 of the Constitution, and that was a committee with Toko Didiza. So the Constitutional Review Committee had a different job than this ad hoc committee. I think that's the point that I want to make. The court case that's going on at the moment is about the previous committee. So this committee had to introduce legislation amending Section 25 of the Constitution by having regard to the recommendations of the Constitutional Review Committee. And they had to report back by the 31st of March. They did not make the deadline because we had elections. So after the elections in July, we had another committee. So now Toko Didiza became the minister. We get a new committee. It's called the Ad Hoc Committee to Introduce Legislation Amending Section 25 of the Constitution. That's its whole name. And it was tasked to come up with specific wording for Section 25. And in December 2019, the committee actually did come up with specific wording and then invited the public for input. Written submissions had to be in by the end of January, and thereafter the committee went on another round of public participation in communities, in the provinces, but this time the question was about the specific wording, so that people had to give input on the specific wording of Section 25. And it is this process that was interrupted by COVID-19. That committee lapsed at the end of May. It was supposed to be done with its work by the end of May, but it couldn't do its work because of COVID. And with a short interval, it was revived again on the same terms as the previous committee to finish the work. But the May meeting was the last meeting that the committee had. Another meeting, its first meeting, was scheduled around somewhere in September, but Parliament is out on constituency work, so the meeting was cancelled. And I think it becomes important now because the due date for a final constitutional amendment, that is, that it must come up with final wording that can be tabled at the National Assembly and voted on is the 31st of December 2020. And they will probably only meet somewhere halfway in October. So I'm not sure if we will reach that due date, and if we do, whether it will be an amendment bill that complies with the requirements of public participation. Because what does public participation look like in a time of COVID? How do you ensure that the public participates? But while that process was going on, we had court case after court case speaking to the state's weak institutional capacity, ordering the state to do certain things. I'm thinking here specifically of the Mwelasi case, where Judge Cameron made it quite clear that at least in that case, pertaining to labor tenants, the Constitution is not an impediment for land reform. So it will be interesting in the future to see the interaction between the legislative processes and what's happening in the courts. So on the legislative front, we have the expropriation bill, as I mentioned before, that was planned to be finalized by June. So they were waiting for the constitutional amendment to be finalized before finalizing the bill. But as I understand it, the bill is now with Cabinet to approve it. And I also understand that it will be tabled with the National Assembly at the end of October for debate. But I think it's quite significant to keep an eye on the process of this bill because it's a very important piece of legislation. There might be, once it's accepted, there might be a few constitutional challenges to the bill. That will by then be an act about the definition of expropriation, for instance, or the null compensation clause, or the role of the courts. And previously it was sent back because it was not clear what's the position of people living on communal land. So that's the biggest challenges that I foresee. But I still don't think that any of these issues will be so glaringly unconstitutional that the bill will be stopped in its tracks, and instead, like most legislation, it will need concrete cases to go to the court so that the court can give specific interpretations or in specific instances declare it unconstitutional. So I think that is very important, that the bill is accepted and it goes through. Because the Constitution only provides a framework for expropriation, but the details is in the expropriation bill. And if we are only making explicit what's implicit in the Constitution, we are not amending, we are clarifying, then it will not change the law. So it will not really have a big impact on an expropriation bill. So it's essential, I'm going to reiterate this again, I think that's where the focus should fall. Expropriation bill is passed to ensure clarity, it sets out clear guidelines, it tells the state how to do its job, and that restricts state power. And it also provides accountability mechanisms, so we know what the state can and cannot do and how we can keep them accountable. Yes, so people often ask, so what's going to happen next? It's very difficult to predict what will happen, and pandemics have quite a sly way of reminding us that any predictions remains just predictions. So I've listened to some of my economist friends, and they said start thinking in various scenarios. So I'm going to propose 3 possible scenarios as with expropriation specifically. In all 3 scenarios, I'm just going to presume that the expropriation bill was enacted. Because I think we're very far in that process. And then there are 3 scenarios. Scenario 1 is the possibility of a slight amendment based on the current wording that might just be slightly amended and then is passed by Parliament. This will not really have a profound impact on the law. The second scenario is that after all the deliberations, after all the processes, all the proposals, the amendment gets tabled, the ANC does not get the support of the EFF because it's not radical enough, and we don't have a constitutional amendment, and we go on. The third scenario is similar to the second scenario, except in this scenario, after taking into consideration inputs from the public, wording is redrafted, or after the process folded in scenario 2, it's redrafted. It's changed significantly, then it will have to go through another public participation process again, and then it gets tabled. And then it might be accepted or not. So either way, I think to keep fixating just on that aspect, you lose sight of the fact that land reform continues. And if land reform continues at this very slow pace of the last 26 years, we will probably have this conversation about the property clause again in the future. I predict in a generation, these things seem to go in generations, so in another 25 to 30 years, and along similar lines, because this is what happened in the 90s. So it's important that for me to address the issues, to work through the issues, and if we cannot resolve the issues, at least lay very good foundations for future similar conversations that is bound to happen. So we also saw an amendment to the Upgrading of Land Tenure Act. Agri-SA also participated there, done after the Constitutional Court ordered the legislature to do so in the Rahube case. But this very small amendment saw quite a fierce deliberation in Parliament because it leaves more questions about land in so-called communal areas than answers, and it was a very narrowly focused amendment. So people are concerned, why do you not, address all the issues? But what I've picked up from dropping in and out of the meetings is this: that civil society can speak up and participate on teams. And if the level of engagement in these deliberations is any precursor of things to come, we are looking forward to lively and challenging debates. But I also think it shows that government will now really start to develop a clear policy of what it envisions with land reform, give us guidelines of what it aims to do, so that the conversation is just better structured. On the policy front, we also had deliberative and political processes going on in the form of the President's Panel on Land Reform and Agriculture of last year that provided a menu of options to consider as far as land reform is concerned. It's unclear how far we are in many of the processes that government said they will take on, but there are some indications. So there's the proactive land acquisition strategy, the PLUS policy, that they seek to amend to allow for blended finance, aiming to ensure that farms acquired in this process are used productively. It's not only for existing farmers, but also for emerging farmers. So the proposal is 50% state grants and 50% from commercial banks. And this focus, I'm sure, is to ensure that there's support for black commercial farmers and to sustain current farmers to farm productively. So this is something positive for organized agriculture. Likewise, there's the Restitution Commission that's also currently reconsidering its settlement models. So after a land claim has been successful, they seem to want to improve on what happens to the land afterwards, and there's a big focus on partnerships. The underlying idea is probably that the transfer of land must make sense. Government does not have a lot of money. They cannot waste a lot of money. But I also think they need to do this very carefully, the partnerships, especially in the restitution process, to ensure that those partnerships do not perpetuate unequal relationships between farmers and beneficiaries, that the partnerships are really done on equal footing, because there's a great resistance from communities sometimes with these partnerships because of that unequal relationship. Just before COVID, we also had the beneficiary selection policy that was published for comment, and it was commented on. So I presume that the comments they received will be considered, and we should soon see a final policy. What's important about this policy, it gives us an indication of who should benefit from land reform. Who does government foresee must benefit from land reform? The other policy is the land donation policy. It aims to facilitate the donation of land. It needs a little bit more detail. There's also the strategic release of state land. I've seen some movement there that government is taking stock of all the land it owns, so it can release it for leasehold purposes. A lot of this land is often very well situated, especially in urban areas, so that's a good move. There are rumors also that the Property Valuation Act, and I'm sure many people will cheer now, those notorious regulations will be reviewed. Agri-SA has been involved with the Mammoth case that was also about these regulations. There are many problems with these regulations, so that's a positive sign. And then we have also seen a change. We will probably also see a change to the land claims court that will become a lands court rather than a narrowly focused land claims court, with permanent judges that specialize in issues of land, and hopefully following a more conciliatory, more the process that we see in labor law as far as land issues are concerned. But we are waiting for a bill to see the specifics of that. Then, of course, there are many private initiatives. You will know more than I do about the private initiatives. The Agricultural Development Agency that was created that aims to provide support for black farmers through public-private partnership initiatives, and many just small initiatives that people do in everyday life. So there is movement, and some of it is positive. Of course, we are waiting to see how it will be implemented. I think that's the biggest challenge for us at the moment. COVID has changed our lives in so many ways, and it also changed our society. So I think the big thing that we will have to look out for is, since our economy is in dire straits, we will probably start to see reports in the next few months also about increasing inequality. And that this inequality will probably still also be mostly on racial lines, and that's of course a powder keg for race and ethnicity issues and doomsday possibilities. So we have to be very, very careful. But the big debates in land reform are surprisingly not whether compensation must be paid for expropriation or not. That's only part of it. There's also a contestation whether the focus should be on transferring land to many small farmers so that many people can benefit, or if we should focus on enabling black commercial farmers to farm successfully, which will see less beneficiaries. We also asked the question, should the state be involved or should it be left to the private sector? And how do we view private property? How strict are we going to protect it, and to what extent will we allow certain things for the greater good to limit private property? How should we strengthen the rights in land of people living in communal areas? Should we go title deeds or should we go some other way? So those are the big questions that's still left out there. And I see them as policy questions. And I think in that regard, government must make a choice, and then we can deliberate on it, and then we can have conversations within the vision. But I think in the absence of many of those issues being clarified, it will be difficult to have constructive conversation. But my guess is that with COVID, the focus will be more on strategies to support economic growth and on attracting investment. The state simply does not have the money or the capacity to do land reform on its own, and it cannot afford in these times to waste money. And for that, policies cannot be too radical. So we are going to have to strike the balance even more finely. Forced acquisition will be left as the last strategy, I think. Expropriation will be one of many tools to be used. It will not be the primary tool. And I think this also indicates that the private sector, you guys, have quite an onerous duty to ensure that land reform works. Because if it doesn't work, then we're going to be in real trouble. And if we step back a little bit, I think we also need to remember always that the moral issues will remain. So even after we have spoken about the economics, even after we have spoken about blended finance and partnerships, there are still moral issues that might remain, dignity issues. And the other conversations that we have when we talk about land will remain and will need to be addressed sensibly, but we need to do this in the correct forums, with skilled mediators, with people that know how to mediate these conversations so that we can at least find some form of consensus on how to address the land injustices of the past while we build a better future for all. Thank you.